All right. Hey, awesome. Welcome back to, I guess we'll do rhetorical situation part two. All right. When we got cut off last time, we were talking about audience. We were talking about the intended and the unintended recipients of the message. And we talked about how we can find little verbal cues, right, in the particular ways of, sometimes in the language, right, particular word choices. Um, Using particular terminology and stuff like that will perhaps let you know who the intended audience is. There may be unintended, there's always going to be unintended audiences for a lot of our articles, but there's going to be an intended audience, someone very specific to whom they are writing. And so we really want to kind of find out who that intended audience is. How would we kind of describe, that particular person based on what we're reading? And so in some cases, in some cases, authors of articles, writers will be very specific and say, it's crystal clear to whom they are writing, but we want to identify that because that makes up the situation, right? So we've got the exigence, we've got the circumstance or an event that has caused or put into motion this need for a conversation. And so articles are responding to these events and participating in a larger conversation, other articles, etc., addressing usually a particular problem, right? And the rhetorical situation also includes an intended audience, a very specific group of people or subgroup of people that to whom they are targeting with their message or article. There's a message in that article, and then all that is defined by what Carroll calls constraints, right? And these kind of limit how the rhetorical message is presented. So we think about that, and a lot of times we're looking at a written article, right? So that automatically has constraints. Does the author have word limit, right? There's only so much space. If we take, is he or she taking a risk by writing super long, huge paragraphs, right? Depending on who the intended audience is. What other limitations? It's going to be read solely online. Is it? How else is it going to be read? What kind of things do we feel limit? Sometimes we have to think about the audience too, because this is be when things like beliefs or attitudes, certain types of facts, right? Are there only so many facts available? So there might be some limitations. So in the early days of COVID, since we're using COVID as our example, or I am, you think about a lot of those articles had a lot of constraints, and some of them still do because we only have so much information yet, right? There's only so much documentation. We're getting studies out. So if let's say that it's a specific article about what the Omicron variant, that's going to have certain limitations because there's only been so many months, right? There's only so much we can do to get facts, to get a bunch of data back to really give us a clue as to what Omicron does or does not do, or what the potential long-term effects may be, right? So those are constraints, right? Those, I think, we don't have all the information in that particular example, right? Does the subject matter warrant and affect traditions? Are there use of images, right? Are there limitations in the kinds of images that can be used? Is the subject matter going to be limited because maybe it's not on the top of people's minds, right? So there's a lack of interest, perhaps, just yet. And then what was the motivation? What are the motives, or what was the motivation, perhaps, pertaining to the situation? And does that create limitations because we got to worry about people's beliefs and attitudes about those motives? So what might be limiting this article? The publication, availability, access to facts, a number of facts, availability of facts, interest in topic, beliefs and attitudes, things we want to think about when we think about constraints. So that makes up the entire rhetorical situation, right? And lastly, we need to kind of understand the writer's argument. So within that context of what the exigence is, what created the necessity for the article to be written, the audience, right? And then we've got the limitations or the constraints. Within that, what is the overall argument? We need to understand the writer's argument. What are they trying to persuade us to do or to think, right? How do they go about doing it? And we're going to discuss more about those specific argument types next week. So don't necessarily worry too much about identifying those specific ones. We're going to talk about that more next week. But for now, just realize as you're reading, try to think about what the writer really wants the audience, right, in this rhetorical situation, either to believe or to do, or to think, or to see maybe the world differently. And then we'll think about how they go about doing that. All right, guys, that's it for rhetorical situation part 2. I'll be back with you. We'll talk a little bit more about beginning to analyze maybe later on in the week. I might